Greetings and salutations, friends, and welcome to more Warhammer 40k lore. Today we are going to look at the Eye of Terror, or the Ocularis Terribus in High Gothic. This ominous-sounding area was originally known as Cygnus X1, and was originally classified as an astrological anomaly by the astrographical adepts of the Imperium of Man. It was only to be known as the Eye of Terror after the Primarch Perturabo named it as such, right before the events of the Horus Heresy really started to kick off. It was, however, no mere spatial anomaly. The Eye of Terror is a massive warp rift and a permanent warp storm, circa 20,000 light years across. It's not entirely the warp, and yet it's not entirely real space. It is a mix of the two. For example, a human could live on a planet within the Eye of Terror, although that planet would not necessarily have to obey by the normal rules of the universe. For example, time could flow far quicker or far slower, and planets could have multiple moons without it impacting their gravity well. The skies could weep blood, and gigantic creatures could wander around eating things without giving too much of a shit about gravity. Essentially, they are technically real space worlds, except most of the actual laws of reality do not really apply. Yet, it is not the warp, which means that an individual's intentions could not shape it as if it was the warp. You can, to some extent, shape these plans, however, but you need a far greater connection to the warp. For example, a demon prince can, to some extent, shape his own demon world. For example, let's say he's a follower of Nurgle. He could relatively easily cover the planet in noxious swamps. Or if he's a follower of Slaanesh, it would essentially be downtown Amsterdam after dark. And it is this curious mix of reality and the immaterium that has led the Eye of Terror to be pretty much the one and only true safe space for the follower of Chaos, following their defeat at the hands of the Imperium after the Great Horus Heresy. Now, before we get into the events of that particular conflict and why it is now chock full of Chaos Space Marines, we have to talk a little bit about how the Eye of Terror was created. I covered this very briefly in my Eldar lore video, where I described how the Eldar race fell into, well, debauchery, essentially, and eventually they got so good at fucking each other that they literally murder-fucked the Chaos God of rape and violent surprise butt sex into existence. That being, naturally, Slaanesh. As you might imagine, murder-fucking a god into existence does have a certain impact upon the world. The other gods had been created over the course of millennia, as emotions had very slowly gathered up in the Immaterium. For example, Khorne started out millions of years ago as just simple feelings of anger, hatred, stuff like that, and it took a very long time for the entity that is today Khorne to form, which is why there are not multiple Eyes of Terror. At least that is the theory. We don't know how the rest of the universe looks, so perhaps there are, in fact, 3 other Eyes of Terror out there somewhere. But considering how the Eldar brought Slaanesh into being, and how surprised everyone was, I think it's relatively safe to assume that Slaanesh is a bit unique. Now, as I mentioned, this did have a somewhat unnatural effect. It created the Rift, the Eye of Terror, which is, as we've already mentioned, kind of a mix between the two worlds, a hole in reality, you could perhaps call it. A hole centered on what was once the core worlds of the Eldar Empire, the most prominent of which are known today as the Crone Worlds. And originally, the Eldar managed to retain a measure of control over some of these worlds, although control is not entirely the right word. They managed to forestall the chaos corruption, but there are no Eldar living on these worlds. They just kind of managed to keep chaos out a little while longer using their Spirit Stone technology. Essentially, the Eldar are capable of capturing the souls of their dead and binding them within so-called Spirit Stones. This means that the souls of dead Eldar will not be sent into the Immaterium, where Slaanesh is eagerly awaiting to show them his massive collection of dragon dildos. Unfortunately for the Eldar who managed to gain at least this measure of safety, the Chaos Gods had other plans, and eventually they managed to manipulate events in such a way that the Crone Worlds got a little bit of a visit from some of the more rebellious elements of the Emperor's finest during the Horus Heresy. Unsurprisingly, these freshly minted Chaos Marines had a lot of fun with the easily breakable Eldar Spirit Stones, and, well, let's just say that whatever measure of control the Eldar had managed to retain over the Crone Worlds was well and truly broken by this chain of events. In the modern 40k, the Eye of Terror has been inhabited by those very Space Marines after their defeat during the Horus Heresy. And the reason why the Eye of Terror is such a lovely safe space for our spiky friends is because it is essentially just a absolutely ginormous warp storm. Navigating even close to the Eye of Terror is ridiculously hard, bordering on impossible, which of course means that the Imperial Navy has very few ways of actually getting access to the Eye of Terror. There are a few stable warp routes that can be used in and out of the Eye, but these are few and far between, and any navigation outside of these stable warp lanes is essentially dice rolling. There is virtually no way of navigating inside the Chaos Warp Storms, and in all due reality, the only way you can travel around inside or even fairly close to the Eye of Terror is to trust that the Chaos Gods will guide your way. Unfortunately, the Chaos Gods are a remarkably fickle bunch, and they don't really tend to help their enemies all that much, although in some cases they will help them out just because funny. But, Arch, I hear you say, if warp travel is essentially impossible within the Eye of Terror, how the hell do the Chaos Forces get around? They can't possibly be using normal drives over distances of thousands of light years, cause, you know, that would take thousands of light years. And no, they don't. They can travel through the warp, as can the Imperium. It is entirely impossible to enter the warp, it's just not very easy to navigate, or in fact, virtually impossible. Essentially, what Chaos Warbands do when they want to go out raiding is they enter the warp, and then they pray. And occasionally, the Chaos Gods will go, alright then, well, I mean, you've done some nice things, and you've sacrificed 100 virgin bulls to me, so I'll pop you out in the rough area you requested. Other times, the Chaos Gods will go, well, you gave me 100 virgin bulls and a duck, but I'm not particularly fond of ducks, therefore I'm going to dump you right in the way of this Imperial Armada, cause fuck you, that is why. This somewhat temperamental way of travelling through the warp means that Chaos raids are entirely unpredictable. They could quite literally appear anywhere. Occasionally, this is to the Chaos Force's benefits. Occasionally, it is not, but it is never really directly to the Imperium's benefits, simply because it's very, very hard to maintain a decent defensive strategy when you haven't the faintest, foggiest clue about where the enemy is actually going to be popping up. There is one upside, however. This temperamental way of transportation means that large-scale movement of troops is virtually impossible. Essentially, if you enter the warp with 100 vessels, odds are that a solid half of those vessels will be appearing in completely different areas than the other half. And that is if the Chaos Gods are being remarkably merciful. If they are not, every single ship is going to find itself at some completely different point in the galaxy, half of which are probably going to be inside of fucking stars. This means that even for the forces of chaos, the only way to get a really sizable chaos fleet out of the Eye of Terror is by making their way out through the Kadian Gates, one of the few stable warp portals around the Eye of Terror. Now, the Kadian Gate is essentially a piece of Necron technology. The Necrons were trying to eradicate the warp entirely from the material world because, well, it's not the most cooperative of forces. However, they never got really far with this, and what they really achieved was just creating various relatively stable tunnels through which the warp could be controlled, so to say. A technology that was probably based to some extent upon the Eldar's own webway technology that essentially creates stable tunnels through the warp. Then again, this is all pure speculation because we don't really know why or how the Necrons created this. Potentially, it could also just be a good old-fashioned MacGuffin. A random plot device or not, however, they are the only safe ways, well, quote-unquote safe. They're still pretty hazardous by warp-traveling standards, but a hell of a lot less hazardous than the alternative, to bring large-scale troop movements out of the Eye of Terror and to a fairly predictable location. And normally, of course, it is the forces of chaos that are trying to get out of the Eye of Terror and into the Imperium. However, the Imperium has occasionally tried to launch crusades of its own into the Eye of Terror. One of these was the Abyssal Crusade, which is going to get a video all of its own eventually, where several chapters of Space Marines were sent into the Eye to repent for their supposed crimes. Crimes of being not entirely pure, that is. The Crusade command staff claims to have laid waste to almost 400 demon worlds within the Eye of Terror, which might sound like a rather remarkable military success, and all due technicality it kind of is, but here's the problem. The Eye of Terror does not operate, as I've already mentioned, by the laws of the physical universe. The 400 worlds that the Space Marines laid waste to could have existed in any point in time. For example, they might have raised 400 worlds over the course of 50 bajillion million trillion years. Or they might have raised all 400 of those worlds in a Saturday afternoon. It's all entirely plausible. Which means that their military actions might have achieved absolutely nothing, or they might have achieved a ridiculous amount. We don't really know. What we do know, however, is that the amount of raids launched by Chaos forces out of the Eye of Terror increased drastically after the Crusade. Not because the Crusade had no effect upon the worlds inside of the Eye of Terror, but because when you send troops into the Eye of Terror, you're not really expecting them to return. And if they do return, they often don't return quite as loyal as they once were, so it is a fairly safe assumption that a lot of those Space Marines that went in came out again with a slightly different world view. As for the insides of the Eye itself, there's a whole host of interesting tales spun around the Eye of Terror, with all kinds of cool little planets with their own histories on them, and these planets really do deserve their own little videos, so I'll probably be doing that at some point, which means in the next 8 or 9 years. I keep extending the timeline just in case, but I'll get to it eventually. I'm thinking, in fact, that I'll probably do the Abyssal Crusade as a bit of a special, probably. It can't be a 50,000 special, because we've already hit that mark, because you bastards keep multiplying far too quickly for me to plan anything, but I'll probably do it for 60,000, perhaps. A nice, big, solid multi-parter, I think, since there's quite a lot of story to be told there, so until then, I have been Arch. Thank you very much for watching, and I do hope to see you all again soon. Have a good day.